All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the 2019 MNHPC Annual Pre-Conference Workshop. We're delighted to welcome Billy Rosa to present The Autumn Leaf, the Human Heart, and the Great Truth, the Art of Bearing Witness. My name's Jess Hassauer, and I am Program Director at Minnesota Network of Hospice and Palliative Care. We're so excited to be kicking off the 2019 annual conference. Again, this year we have over 1,000 attendees participating in the conference. These attendees represent 24 different states and 2 Canadian provinces. We are very proud to be the largest conference focused on serious illness and end-of-life care in the region. So the pre-conference workshop has been a key part of the annual conference for the past 7 years. It's a wonderful way to begin the conference. We do a deep dive on an important topic. We have a nationally known speaker. And we've been really fortunate to have outstanding speakers lead our pre-conference, and this year is no different. We provide this education in partnership with our joint provider, the Minnesota Medical Association. We're so grateful for MMA's support, clear direction, and partnership. Key information about continuing education. So you must complete the online evaluation by April 30th. The evaluation will be emailed to you using the email address that you used to register for the conference. Certificates will be emailed to you by May 15th. There were no relationships to commercial interests disclosed prior to this learning activity. Further information can be found on the conference website or at the registration desk. Now, I'd like to recognize the University of Minnesota School of Nursing and the Katharine J. Densford International Center for Nursing Leadership for supporting the pre-conference workshop through the Florence, Schorske, Wald lectureship. It is because of the vision of Dr. Daniel J. Peshet that the pre-conference workshop came to be. And it has grown to become an integral part of the annual conference and a valuable learning opportunity for healthcare professionals in our region. We are grateful for the support of the School of Nursing and Densford Center and to Dr. Peshet for his leadership. Dr. Peshet is a professor of nursing in the Nursing Population Health and Systems Cooperative Unit of the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota. He is an author, speaker, coach, and consultant who is known as a forward-thinking leader who is respected for his ability to inspire and support others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Peshet, who will introduce our speaker today.
I'd also like to take a minute to recognize my boss, Dean Connie Delaney from the University of Minnesota School of Nursing. She's sitting here. Connie, would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you. Well, for more than a century, the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota has led the advancement of nursing education, nursing research, practice, health, and healthcare delivery. We have outstanding faculty, staff, and students and committed alumni, and we have many community partners and a clear mandate from the land-grant origins. We have a responsibility to address the dynamic grand challenges of the state, the nation, and the world. You might not know this, but the School of Nursing is the longest continuously operating nursing program in the country that was originally established within a university. In 1909, the first nursing program within a university was at the University of Minnesota. On May 1st of this year, the school will commemorate its history and celebrate its bright future of lifting the educated spirit of the nurse and nursing. Nursing and nursing education are what they are today in large part because of the actions of an individual named Richard Olding Beard, who chaired the physiology program at the University of Minnesota. He is credited with bringing nursing into the institution of higher learning with the Board of Regents when the nursing program was established in 1909. Beard passionately advocated for the advancement of nursing, believing that educating nurses, rather than training them, as was the practice, would help society recognize the worth of human life, conserve human health, and provide for social justice. His pioneering advocacy for lifting up the nursing profession was expressed in writings and speeches in which he espoused for, quote, educating the spirit of nurses. Historian Deborah McClurg-Jensen said Beard's actions were a step of the greatest consequence for the nursing profession, adding that it was the final step in the creation of the nursing profession. The current vision of the School of Nursing is to create a world where nurses lead collaborative efforts to obtain optimal health for all people. Our mission is to generate knowledge and prepare nurse leaders who will create, lead, and participate in holistic efforts to improve the health of all people within the context of their environment. The Florence Schorske Wald Lectureship on Hospice and Palliative Care was established in 1997 to honor Florence Schorske Wald, who is credited with bringing the hospice movement to the United States from England. The funders of this lecture, Charles Shepard and Derry Ann Moritz, envisioned that it would challenge individuals and institutions as they move toward innovative practice in hospice care and promote collaboration between the world of academic and practice in the Twin Cities. The annual lectureship provides a public forum for hearing a noted scholar in the area of palliative and care and hospice end-of-life care, and for drawing together faculty and care providers throughout the community to reflect on the care of persons who are dying. There have been a number of distinguished scholars who have delivered the Wald Lecture over the years. It is my pleasure to introduce this year's scholar, Mr. Billy Rosa. He said, advance slide. Billy Rosa is currently a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Future of Nursing Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing in Philadelphia, and a palliative care nurse practitioner at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. Mr. Rosa completed a one-year palliative care fellowship at Sloan Kettering in 2017. He is the editor of 3 books on leadership, global health, and theory-guided practice, and has contributed to more than 100 publications in a host of diverse forums. Mr. Rosa has been recognized with numerous national and international distinctions. He serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Hospice and Palliative Care Nursing and is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, the American College of Critical Care Medicine, and the New York Academy of Medicine. More recently, he was honored with the 2018 National Lillian Wald Service Award from the American Public Health Association Nursing Section. Please join me in welcoming Billy Rosa.
Good afternoon. How's everybody? Minneapolis, what are you doing to me? It's cold here. I'm a New Yorker. It just got warm. Summer's over. Okay. You're not hallucinating. The leaves are moving. So I am so excited to be here. And just thank you for Dan Peschet and the University of Minnesota School of Nursing for inviting me to be here with all of you. I'd love to know who's in the room. So who's from Minneapolis? Show of hands. Who's from out of state? I guess everybody else. So where are people from? Nebraska. Wisconsin. West Virginia, very cool. New York. Anywhere else? South Dakota, very cool. Welcome. And professionally, who's in the room? Nurses? Social workers? Very cool. Physicians? Very cool. Who'd I miss? Chaplains. Death doulas. Nurse practitioners. Anybody else? Students. I'm a student. Yes. Okay, so I'm thrilled to be here. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about the autumn leaf, the human heart, and the great truth, and really the art of bearing witness. So the theme of this conference is navigating the journey with compassion. And I think that the art of bearing witness is one of the most sacred privileges that we have working in this field. And I think that in order to do that effectively and appropriately, we need to be able to do that with compassion. And in my experience, compassion can be a very difficult, challenging virtue to embody at times, particularly in our time constraints and with our agendas and everything we have to get done. So what we're going to do this afternoon is we're going to break compassion down into really actionable, reliable components so that we can plant these seeds of compassion today through a series of embodiment practices, getting into our bodies, getting into the practice, what it feels like to actually awaken those traits and experiences, so that when you go back to work or you show up for your family later, it's kind of in your body and ready to go. Everybody doing okay? So here's what we're going to be doing today. So these are the broader objectives for the whole session. We're going to be identifying opportunities to create caring, healing environments through bearing witness with compassion. So that has a few parts, right? Caring and healing. We're going to be talking about the environment. And that environment goes beyond the physical space, but it's the environment that we are creating as the primary instruments of healing for our patients and our families. So, at a very physical level, Dr. Jean Watson talks about this, that at the physical level, when we're creating healing environments, we're talking about making sure the room is clean and neat, making sure blankets are folded, all of that stuff, right? Making sure the counters are clean. At a deeper level, the healing environment becomes this space between me and you. We create this healing environment. The space between us actually becomes an environment that creates and sustains healing. And at the deepest level, the palliative care specialist, whoever you are, whatever your specialty, becomes the healing environment. So that when you walk into the space, you are attuned to a vibration of caring and healing, and you carry that with you wherever you go and whatever you do. And we're going to be talking about, again, bearing witness with compassion. So we're going to break both of those things down. We're going to use a conscious dying philosophy in the context of serious illness and at the end of life. So conscious dying philosophy, I have to credit my dear friend Taryn Estes, who I'm so sad is not here today. Just take a moment to wish her well. She's a little under the weather. And Taryn and I have written a lot about conscious dying. We've developed this philosophy. We've built this philosophy. She runs a business called the Conscious Dying Institute. I have nothing to disclose, but she does use the philosophy in her training. So we're not talking about the institute, we're talking about the philosophy. And then we're going to employ an array of integrative modalities for managing both pain, but also strengthening the mind-body connection and promoting an overall sense of well-being. What I want you to tune yourself to is that everything we do that's an embodiment practice today is a modality. So while what we just did this morning was a modality, right? It's a way of helping people energize, get out of their head, get into their body, feel safe, create groundedness, create presence. And we're going to move through those embodiment practices with everything we do. Some of them you'll like. Some of them you won't like. Some of them will upset you. Some of them will enliven you, right? And so the purpose of every modality today is to give you tools so that when we're bearing witness with compassion for our patients and our families, and they're doing the difficult work of trying to be present with pain, or trying to empathize with a loved one who they don't like, or trying to move through a period of forgiveness in their life. It's very hard to bear witness to those kinds of emotions when we have no understanding of what it feels like in our body and what it feels like in our life. It's very hard to be there without judgment, and it's very hard to be there to facilitate healing. So everything we do today is just with the intention of giving you another tool, okay? So if you don't like it, try to stay present. There's an acronym: surrender, allow, trust, accept. Surrender, allow, trust, accept. You don't have to, but it helps, okay? So let's talk about bearing witness for a second. I want to clarify what we mean by bearing witness, because bearing witness can be perceived as a little bit of a passive thing at times. I happen to think it's one of the most sacred privileges we have in caring for patients and families, bearing witness to their struggles and their realities in their most vulnerable and painful moments. So Julie Katsaris and I wrote a chapter in a book by Mary Jo Kreitzer recently, and we talk about bearing witness, and we write that by remaining active participants who are allowing, acknowledging, and releasing the suffering of another, bearing witness becomes a spiritual practice of the highest order. So there's a few things in there, right? The first is the active stance, right? This is about active engagement. When I'm bearing witness, there's a lot going on. There's deep listening. There's the ability to hold silence. There's the ability to hold space, whatever that means to you, right? And there's also authentic presence. And what I mean by authenticity is authenticity to the moment. Being authentic to the moment. Whatever that moment's bringing up, sadness, grief, joy, love, worry, anxiety, uncertainty, doubt, whatever it is, being authentic to the moment. But also this tool, right? This is a modality, being able to allow, acknowledge, and release. Allow, acknowledge, release. Continually allowing what the moment brings, acknowledging that that's what's happening, and releasing it so you can be present for the next moment. Allowing what's coming up between us, acknowledging that that's what's happening, and then releasing it so I can be present for the next moment. And that is a real muscle. That is a real muscle that you can build. So then we go on to say that being in passivity permits the experience at hand to both abuse our senses and dominate our abilities to respond powerfully and appropriately. So how many of you have had the experience of being in the type of family meeting where everybody's just kind of struck by the difficulty of the conversation and everybody's just kind of quiet and doesn't know what to do? Yeah? Only 4 of us? Wow, palliative care is taken off in Minneapolis because that's like a daily, experience at work for me. But yes, confronting our habits of passivity and being able to become more active engagers in the process, right? That's what we're talking about. So we can be in our power and we can respond appropriately. And then we finish by saying the privilege of bearing witness is an intervention for spirit, mind, and body that engages our wholeness, the ultimate integrative act, connecting human beings and promoting healing on all levels. So it's a privilege, it's an intervention, and it engages our wholeness. So if we're not in tune, Pema Chodron says that there is no healing between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Right? So when we're actually bearing witness, when we're actually being present with compassion, it requires us to draw on our wholeness, which means our ability to show love and joy, but also our ability to be aware of and be present to our fear and our own terror and our own grief. And so that's some of what we're going to explore today. Sounds like a good time, right? So, and I think that this process of bearing witness is a journey. It is something that takes time. It is something that we build. It is something that we continue to journey on. It's like a beautiful spiraling path, right, where we just start to see all the different colors. It's like the ability to play a song with all of the keys on the keyboard, right, not excluding any part of the experience. That's really hard to do. It actually takes quite a bit of awareness and presence to be able to do that. And I think that doing it with compassion and invoking a stance of compassion in our practice, in our intention, as we work, as we go to work, in our lives, at home, with our family, with our friends, I think compassion gives us a path forward to be able to do that and to be able to do it for ourselves. So we're going to talk about compassion, and we're going to break down compassion into its component parts. But I'm going to start with a story about a man named Lord Buddha, who was born in approximately 400 BC in the area now known as Nepal. And so Siddhartha, who later became known as the Buddha, or the Enlightened One, was a prophet who realized the essential unreality of the world. And he's said to have experienced the bliss of nirvana. And I want to say up front, this is not any kind of Buddhist agenda. I was raised Catholic. I take lots of different faiths into my consideration. It's just about philosophy. So Buddha was brought up in a palace with all of the comforts possible, all the luxuries possible. And at one point in his early adult life, he forsook the comforts of the palace to find a greater meaning. And so in disguise, he left his home and his family, and he wandered around the kingdom. And here Siddhartha came across death, old age, illness, suffering, and it showed him this transitory nature of life, and it had a great impact on him. And as a consequence, he resolved himself to a spiritual, deeper way of living. And after years of meditation and intensive spiritual practice, he's said to have achieved enlightenment. And he spent the remainder of his life teaching others how to escape this cycle of death and birth and so on. And so a lot of the stories we hear about the Buddha occur in this teaching phase. His essential teachings were of love, tolerance, and compassion. And the Buddha taught that we have to develop compassion for all living beings, ourselves included. And this was known to be his most essential lesson. But here's the story. Few people know that Buddha had a cousin named Devadatta. Now, Devadatta was extremely jealous of the Buddha. He felt that he himself was just as good as the Buddha, and he was jealous that people ignored him. They didn't honor him the way they honored and praised the Buddha. And so he was always thinking of ways to harm the Buddha. So one day, Devadatta devised a plot to kill the Buddha. He knew that Siddhartha would be traveling through a particular town on a particular day at a particular time, and he brought an elephant and hid it beside a wall. He then fed the elephant a lot of liquor and made him drunk. Now, his plan was to manipulate this drunken elephant and then use her to trample the Buddha. So seeing from the distance that the Buddha was coming, he immediately used sticks to beat the elephant brutally. The drunken elephant was in great pain, great suffering, totally enraged. And seeing this, he released the elephant in the direction of the Buddha. Now, this elephant was overwhelmed with anger, and the elephant was mad. So he started at full speed towards the Buddha. It raised its ears, its tail, its trunk. It made a lot of noise. It's like thunder was striking. That's the kind of noise. All the disciples who were with the Buddha were horrified and ran from harm's way, except for Ananda, the Buddha's loyal attendant, who stood firmly beside him. Now, the Buddha's compassion was said to be so strong, so powerful, that the elephant could feel it. And just a few steps before he was to trample the Buddha, the elephant stopped in its path and calmed down. He then calmly trotted toward the Buddha and bowed her head. The Buddha comforted her with soft and kind words. And this mad elephant was now totally tamed. So I use that story as an example and a confession. It's obviously an example of courageous compassion amid pain and suffering. I think the type of pain and suffering we see so much of in our world right now. But it's also an example to say that as I stand here today and I share these thoughts on compassion with you, I am by no means an expert. And I know this to be true because if a mad elephant was loose in the DoubleTree by Hilton, I would be the first one out of here. So no worries there. So the truth is that today we really do face herds of mad elephants across the country. Right? Some of these mad elephants are just humanity's unconsciousness kind of run amok. But some of them are the distinct consequences of fear, separation, inequity, inequality, judgment, discrimination, so many of the issues that come up in our social arena. They are literally charging at humanity with the anger and the rage of destruction. And they really challenge us to consider, how do we bear witness with compassion? How do we actually embody these virtues, particularly in troubling circumstances where there is serious illness, where there is a lack of closure around emotion, where people are considering the impact of their life, where people are dying. And so some of my questions to you this morning are, can we, like the Buddha, learn to tame these mad elephants with a loving heart? Can we stand our ground like we did at the opening? Observe these mad elephants that are charging toward us and learn to hold them without judgment. Do we have the spiritual dexterity to return to what it means to be compassionate in the most basic sense? So I want to dive a little bit into what some of these mad elephants are in the US. We have some people from Canada here today. Not here, just the main conference. Great, because we're going to talk about the US. I didn't want to offend anybody. So, in the US, we have some of these mad elephants. We have a rapidly aging population, right? So by the year 2060, there's supposed to be about 98 million older persons. That's double what there was in about 2013. right? So it makes us think about the malleability and the flexibility and the adaptability of our health systems and our ability to do things like compassion, right? We also have this continued rise in chronic illness, where about a quarter of all adults in America have one or more chronic illness, and just under 50% of all Americans have 2 or more chronic illnesses. Right? When we look at the top 10 causes of death in our country, chronic illness are the vast majority. I think it's like 7 or 8 of the top 10 causes. Right? We have huge costs. When we look at the Commonwealth Fund's report in the United States spending in comparison to other high-income nations, we spend the most on healthcare, about 18.2% of our GDP. That's about $3.4 trillion a year. That is well over $10,000 per person per year. It's double total what the UK spends on healthcare, and about 50% higher than the next highest spender, which is France. And we have the worst outcomes among those same high-income nations. So the way we're spending money is not working, and a lot of the people that we care for at the end of life are using most of the resources, and yet we see that they're not really getting the care that they need. So something's missing there. We have this opioid crisis that's hit our country since the 1990s, starting with OxyContin, a second wave around 2010 with the rise of heroin, and then again a third wave in 2013 with the increased use of synthetic opioids and fentanyl. So between 1997 and 2017, the number of deaths where an opioid was implicated has increased 6-fold. Right? And people who are older have the highest number of prescribed opioids, but people who are younger, between 15 and 24, have the highest risk of dying. And actually, a recent report says that the odds of dying from an opioid overdose are higher than the odds of dying in a car crash for the first time in America. Major social justice issues, just think about everything that's happened in the last few years, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, right? The Flint water crisis, the inequities that come up, the incarceration rates, the inequities among those incarceration rates, right? This affects how people live and how people die and how people access the services that we offer. And then we have this overt medicalization of systems, this dehumanization of patients, right? Where we see full thinking, feeling, seeing human beings, their narrative, their story, their contributions whittled down to a disease and a bed number. We see it every day. The liver cancer in bed 4, for example, right? A friend and colleague, Janet Quinn, writes that when she first started in the ICU as a nurse, she saw technically brilliant nurses who were simply unable to be present for their patients. And she wrote, and then one day it happened. I became that nurse, the nurse I said I would never be, who left the patient uncovered just trying to get the job done, but for that one moment had forgotten the most basic moral human stance. And this dehumanization that we see is truly an epidemic in our profession and in healthcare. Could I ask you guys just to check your phones and see if we could silence them? Just make sure they're on silence, please. At global and planetary levels, we're also confronting these mad elephants. We have a major healthcare worker shortage. We can't deliver good palliative care without enough healthcare workers. By the year 2030, the Global Health Workforce Alliance says that there will be 40 million new healthcare jobs open in the healthcare sector. The majority of those will be in high and middle income countries. And at the same time, there will be an 18 million healthcare worker shortage, primarily in low and middle income countries. So it just highlights the way those inequities and inequalities worldwide between nations are actually getting worse. They're actually growing and expanding. Universal health coverage is the primary goal of the World Health Organization and the United Nations. That's healthcare for you, no matter who you are, where you live, your education level, how much money you have, who makes your laws. And a lot of the literature on universal health coverage has focused on just access to services at the point of care. And now people are finally starting to talk about quality. What is the quality of care going to look like when we have universal health coverage? And the question always comes up in the palliative care arena, particularly when we think of palliative care as a public health priority. Is palliative care a part of universal health coverage? Is hospice care a part of what we mean by the right to universal health coverage? Something to think about. Social determinants of health. As of 2015, about 5 of the 7.5 billion people on the planet lived in low or middle income countries where extreme poverty limited their ability to create and sustain health and well-being. It limited their access to services like palliative and hospice care. Right? 1 in 9 people worldwide are undernourished. 103 million lack basic literacy skills. No surprise that 60% of them are women. Right? And there are just vast, vast inequities within our nation, between nations, according to age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, differing levels of physical ability, or what we call disability, right? Displaced people in violence. This is really an upper, right? I'm really setting the mood for a good time here. But this is the reality, right? And this is what we have to find a way to be able to bring compassion to in a very practical way. According to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, there's about 65 million people who've been forcibly displaced worldwide. So it's about 34,000 people per day who have fled their home due to persecution and violence. And last, and something that's quite overlooked very often, is this degradation of planetary health. Show of hands, how many of you have heard of planetary health? Oh my God, thank you. I talk about planetary health all the time. Usually it's 2 or 3 hands. That was like 20 whole hands. It was great. So planetary health, so back in 2015, the Rockefeller Foundation and Lancet Commission released a report on planetary health. And they said so planetary health is this idea that humanity and really human survival depends on flourishing natural systems and the wise stewardship of those systems. And so the report said that the planet is actually losing its capacity to support the growing human population with a severe degradation of our air, our water, our land, and a significant loss in biodiversity. And that loss in biodiversity allows things like Ebola to happen, right? It allows things like the hurricane in Puerto Rico to happen, right? It allows all of the wildfires in California to happen. And so we're seeing how this affects, again, access to care. So why is this important? I think it starts to help us make the case for compassion. We have to make the case for compassion in our systems because people don't prioritize it. How many of you would say that in your health systems, compassion is a priority? Not a value, a priority. Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Was that really it, just 4? Or were you being shy? How many of you in your systems would you say compassion is a priority? That's awesome. Great. I want to hear from you more later when we talk about how we can reflect on our systems, what our systems are doing well, so we can help each other to build on that. So Christy Dempsey, who's the Chief Nursing Officer of, and please, I do say nurse a lot, nursing. I'm a nurse practitioner, I'm a nurse. That's just my lens, but I think a lot of what we're talking about really transcends discipline. So when I say nurse, please don't feel excluded if you're not a nurse. Please feel included, because I'm including you, and I mean to include you in this conversation. So Christy Dempsey, who's the Chief Nursing Officer of Press Ganey, says, we are actually in an epidemic of suffering. There is an epidemic of suffering, not just physically, but there is an unspoken epidemic in how we treat people, how healthcare systems are functioning, right? Gene Watson says we are the light in the institutional darkness, right? There is an institutional darkness that many of us have encountered where human beings cease being human beings. And she says the antidote is really compassionate, connected care. Compassionate, connected care. She actually says that those patient satisfaction scores that patients fill out that tell us how we're doing, what they're actually measuring is compassion. Our ability to be compassionate and deliver compassionate services. And I'm going to hold up a scale in a little bit that will show the patient satisfaction scale and how it aligns with compassionate values. And she says that there are 6 components of compassionate, connected care. The first is acknowledging suffering. Acknowledgement to me is one of the most powerful tools that we have. And I mean literally articulating acknowledgement. I acknowledge what you're going through right now. I want to acknowledge the experience you're having. Just think about how it feels when you're working really hard or you want something and somebody acknowledges you for that effort, a sincere acknowledgement. I have this memory of this patient in the ICU, her and her husband. The wife was the patient. I forget her primary cancer now, very advanced, in the ICU, in a coma, not sedated, just not responsive for about 2 weeks. Their country of origin was India. The husband was a diplomat. And the husband had gained this reputation for being really aggressive, really angry, really nasty, right? The difficult patient, right? And he and his wife's parents really, really, really wanted the patient to receive Ayurvedic medicines every day through her nasogastric tube. And it would be about a liter of Ayurvedic medicine that she would be getting over the course of a day. And because her liver was failing and because her kidneys were failing, the ICU team was in pure resistance. Absolutely not. We don't know what's in these medicines. We don't know if it's going to just keel her over right into death. That puts our staff in an unsafe position, right? And we're endangering our patient and we might not even know it. And so this automatic clash started to happen every day about this medicine. And we were in a family meeting, and I was the palliative care consultant in the room, and the ICU physician and this husband were just going at it. It was one of the most uncomfortable things. It was like watching two people talking about completely different things, right? It was like somebody talking, like saying the alphabet, and the one counting to 10. It was like bizarre, right? And there was a moment where he said something that resonated so powerfully with me. He said, "You are not listening to me. Your pain, her pain, and her suffering are none of your concern. They belong to me. I will bear her pain and her suffering. Stop talking about that. It's none of your business. You worry about curing her cancer. That's why we're here." And the ICU physician was ready to shut down the meeting because it just came across as, right? This guy was in pain. He was in pain. And before she stood up to leave, I just paused and I said, "Could I just take a moment? I want to acknowledge something you just said. I want to acknowledge that bearing the pain and the suffering of your wife every day and feeling like you're alone in it is unimaginable. And I'm so sorry that you're having to do this and go through this right now." And this man, this giant of a man who had taken up so much space and had been so aggressive, broke down. Just became a baby at the table. Just wept, right? That acknowledgement was like, it was like a glass of fresh water on like a really hot day. That's what it felt like, you know? And all of a sudden we started talking. And all of a sudden we started listening. And the patient got the medicine. And there was a compromise in there. She didn't get the whole liter every day, but there was a compromise in there. We started hearing the humanity in each other's voice. So acknowledgement is an incredible tool. The second aspect of compassionate connected care is body language matters. Our body language matters, right? If we want to be connected to patients, and we'll go through some of the literature, what it says about compassion, patients feel it as soon as we walk into the room, actually before we walk into the room, right? Like my favorite is when somebody's in the room and the patient's saying, "Will you come back?" And you're like, yeah, I'll come back, right? The experience of being vulnerable in the bed and being so dependent on people and having their back to you as they're verbally telling you that they'll be back, and everything about their physicality says, "Not going to see you for a while," right? A few weeks ago, there was a woman whose daughter, about 28, she had had cancer for about 10 years, really struggled with severe treatment, adverse effects of treatment. She had been treated at my hospital for years. She comes in, there's a new primary oncologist on service. Never met her. Never met this 29-year-old girl or her mother. And he walks in and he says, "Hi, I'm Dr. So-and-so. There's nothing left we can do for your cancer." And as the mom started to say, "Well, you don't understand. I'm sitting in a chair being there as support for the mom and the patient, and he is hovering over her saying, 'I'm not going to discuss this with you.'" Right? So it wasn't just the words. The words were harsh in my opinion, but it was his body language. It was aggressive. And as I listened, I had a great deal of compassion for him. Who says when you know better, you do better? I mean, like, you know, he would have done better had he known. But then he did eventually at some point, later in the afternoon, tap into how he has his own children and how he understands how devastating this must be. But even then, his body language was constricted and pulling back and not available, right? So really conscious of our body language. She also says, number 3, that anxiety is suffering. I love that. Anxiety and uncertainty are suffering. They are real outcomes. And I don't know if you would agree, but my patients who happen to be in the most pain, who seem to have horrible physical symptoms, but also this mental, emotional, existential, exacerbated total pain, those patients, much of the time are the most anxious. And much of the time have no idea they're anxious. Right? They don't know how to identify it in themselves. It's just a way of being. And so if we're going to identify this epidemic of suffering and actually be present to it, we have to see how we feel about anxiety and uncertainty, and then hold a safe space of them to reflect on theirs. The fourth part is coordinating care. So she says it's our actual duty and our responsibility to ensure that our patients and their families know at every point along their disease and care trajectory that they are cared for and cared about, and there is somebody to shepherd them throughout the experience. Right? That is our responsibility. And when I see breakdown in communication, it's often because patients feel lost. Haven't seen the primary team today, haven't gotten an update from my surgeon, haven't heard anything from the oncologist, don't know what's going on with this procedure from downstairs, don't know what time I'm going to the OR, right? There is a breakdown in just basic, simple, civil communication, which should be easy, but it's not. The fifth part is autonomy reduces suffering. And autonomy is a really interesting conversation that we don't have time to talk about today much, but not just autonomy of patients, autonomy of their families. When we talk about human-centered care, which I'm going to define later, which is something Taryn and I write about, Taryn Estes and I write about, and we talk about relationship-based care. I have a professor who's an ethicist, and she is so clear about the commitment we have to family and family autonomy, because particularly in the context of dying, the family are actually the ones that go on living. They are actually the ones that have to live with the trauma of the healthcare system and the trauma of seeing their loved ones die in certain ways, right? So this is not just about empowering patient autonomy, but ensuring that we're bringing everybody into the fold, that we're allowing everybody to feel that empowerment. And there's a lot of dexterity involved in that sometimes. And the last part of compassionate, connected care is that caring transcends diagnosis. That is my favorite one. Caring transcends diagnosis. Diagnoses come and go. They may kill us, but they come and go. What goes on and what lives on is the caring that we choose to give or not give, and the kindness we choose to give or not give. Right? That is actually what lives on in the memories of those who continue to be alive. The next thing I think is really important in making this case for compassion has to do with an ethical stance. So Beecham and Childress, who've really written the Bible on biomedical ethics, they talk about compassion as a focal virtue of caring, right? So it's a focal virtue of how we experience caring in the healthcare system. They call it a prelude to caring, which I love. And that compassion as this focal virtue provides a moral compass for us. And they do talk a little bit about how some people avoid compassion because they think it's a little too sappy, they don't think it's important, they don't think it's a professional obligation, and they're worried about getting burnt out. So they talk about compassionate detachment, which is an interesting concept, and we can talk a little bit more about later. Compassion for me, this is my stance, is that compassion invites us to bring our spirituality into action. So all the things we talk about at church on Sunday, or temple, or mosque, or all the things we reflect on during meditation, or if we don't have a spiritual practice, maybe a lot of the virtues we can agree just make us good human beings. Compassion is actually the avenue that allows us, because compassion is rooted in action, it actually allows us to translate these theoretical notions of what makes us good human beings and what makes a strong humanity, and actually allows us to humanize it. It actually allows us to translate it into the world. And that's what compassion means to me. And we have to be aware of the promoting and the hindering factors involved with compassion, right? The promoting factors, things like self-care. 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 Things like caring colleagues, supporting each other. I know that was a rough morning. How are you doing? Simple things, right? Healthy work environments where people can process their own grief, their own transference for the day. but also the hindering factors, right? Like compassion fatigue and moral distress and burnout, right? Is this the most burnt out nurse you've ever seen? I mean, but like I know her, right? I know her. And what I find fascinating is that the misnomer is that we burn out because we care too much. But if we actually look, and I know that it says it in the nursing literature, I'm sure it's present in other literature, but we actually don't burn out because we care too much. We burn out because we're not able to provide the level of caring that we often came into this profession to give, because we work in systems that constrain and confine us. And we are in an ethical distress more often than not, feeling the tear between wanting to be compassionate, wanting to contribute to the betterment of humanity, and yet feeling restrained to do so, right? So these challenges, the mad elephants, the whole case for compassion, they're really complex. And I often think my case is that charging in with some grand ideal of what we think compassion looks like can actually be quite harmful, right? And it can actually lead to quite a bit of self-disappointment. And so my statement, which may be controversial, right? Surrender, allow, trust, accept, or not accept, is that if we're trying to be compassionate, whatever that means, we may be trying too hard. If we're trying to be compassionate, we may be trying too hard. And here's why I say that. Because compassion is what I like to call an advanced spiritual skill. And where there's a skill, there's a, anybody? Healthcare? Competency? Yes? Right? And actually, when we look at the healthcare system and books like Christina Dempsey's, we are actually starting to try to quantize compassion, measure it, make sure it shows up, demand it, expect it, right? So while you're caring for 6 patients and getting a new ED admission and getting someone ready for CAT scan and providing education before they go home and lost in the supply closet looking for a bulb syringe, be compassionate, right? Really hard, really hard. I can't be compassionate. I can't do compassion. But what I can do is I can create environments and habits and ways of being that allow compassion to awaken. I can plant seeds of compassion and build compassionate relationships. And with you, I may come to realize a compassionate healthcare system, right? It's actually much smaller. It's not the grand ideal. And so compassion as some systematic and theoretical notion really does make me uncomfortable. And that's because the Buddha said it was at the heart of every human being. The task is learning to tap into that space. Right? So for me, I have moments of compassion, moments where it overwhelms me, where it humbles me, where it grounds me. But can I say I live from that space all the time? No. I'm a New Yorker. I don't do that. You know? And so we have to return to the basics, right? Simply ask, what are the actions that will awaken compassion? So Suzuki said in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, in the beginner's mind, there are many, many possibilities. In the experts, there are few. So today, we're just going to talk about compassion from a beginner's mind, using a beginner's stance. And we're going to start at the very beginning. So we're going to talk about what compassion means. It comes from the Latin pati and cum, literally meaning to suffer with. And so that quote from Pema Chodron before, I'll repeat it. She says that compassion draws on the wholeness of our experience, so our suffering and our empathy, as well as our cruelty and our terror. So she says it's not a relationship between healer and wounded, but a relationship between equals. So basically, compassion is like this whole person event, right? Compassion calls on us to be our full selves, and that is a big order. And it's not in the talk. It's not in the theory. It truly is in the action. So I want to shake this off for a second, and I first want to talk about what compassion is not. Compassion is not about being emotionally sloppy. It's not about giving until we fall to pieces. Not about that. Dr. Alex Lickerman says there are 5 things that compassion is not. I love this. This is one of my favorite parts of the whole talk. Compassion is not giving people what they want. Love it, right? So when we think about what people want, what's actually in their best interest, or what actually they need is not always what they want. And so when we're giving away our time and our talent and our resources and our energy, we have to think with our head as well as our heart, not just freely giving away what we think they want. And that requires deep listening and bearing witness. It's not sacrificing ourselves. I know her too. Yeah? It is not overwhelming, overbearing sacrifice. So compassion, taking more time, may be a part of demonstrating compassion, sometimes, but it cannot become overwhelming, overbearing sacrifice, because then what we see is another's health and well-being usurps our own. And if our compassion does not include ourselves, it is incomplete. This one's my favorite. Compassion is not being constantly gentle. It is not this puppies and rainbows notion. It just isn't, right? It requires strength to confront inequity. It requires presence and grit to speak up against things that are unfair and that prevents people from receiving the hospice and palliative care services that they need to live well until they are no longer alive. There is nothing gentle about that. And the example I always use at a societal level is Gandhi in India. Let's think about this amazing man for a second. So back in 1930, Britain had these Salt Acts that prohibited Indians from collecting and selling salt from the oceans that crashed on their own shores. And so back in 1930, Gandhi led the Salt March all the way from Ahmedabad to the Arabian Sea. He marched for 240 miles, and led to the arrest of 60,000 people, all the while espousing great compassion for the absolute ignorance of his oppressors. Right? Nothing gentle about that. Compassion is not getting a reward. I actually think being acknowledged for the work you do is really important. I think asking for acknowledgement for the work you do is really important, right? It's important to be seen for what you do. But when the reward becomes the primary motivator for the work, it's actually quite detrimental to both ourselves and the integrity of our work. So my strong second favorite is the last one. Compassion is not liking everyone. Oh my God, it's such a relief, right? I swear for a good part of my life, I was trying to be all spiritual and really get it down. And I thought I was why can't I be compassionate? I don't like her. Right? And Dr. Alex Lickerman says, guess what? You can actually actively dislike someone and still have great compassion for them. Right? You're still accountable for striving for compassion. So while you acknowledge that there may be people you don't like, maybe people you don't wish to spend time with, you're actually still accountable for your compassion. And so one of the biggest misconceptions I think about compassion is that to be compassionate, we have to give up our boundaries. It's a big misconception. Yeah? I see a lot of head nodding. That's great. So Brené Brown is a researcher, vulnerability and shame researcher, who, in her grounded theory research, has found that compassionate people are actually the most boundaried people. So she says that boundaries help us protect our compassion. They help us secure it. And so Brown says that the heart of compassion is real acceptance, and that it's really hard to accept people when they're walking all over you and taking advantage of you. And so if you really want to learn to be compassionate in a sustainable, real way, we have to start by setting boundaries, committing to them, and having the courage to hold people accountable for their behavior. Right? That's radical to me. That really changed the way I saw this work. So we have to talk about how compassion is actually received. So there are a few measures of compassion in the literature. This is probably one of the most popular, the Schwartz Center Compassionate Care Scale. Uses 16 criteria. It was developed in 1998, had some revisions. And originally, it assessed how physicians primarily and other providers provided this care. And it really wanted to establish empirical evidence to make the case for compassionate care. Now, this is really interesting to me. When we hold the ACHPN survey questions next to the Schwartz Center questions, they mirror each other. So this supports Christina Dempsey's theory that when we're measuring patient satisfaction, we're actually measuring compassion. And this, to me, is one of those articles that you can use to really make the case to your institutions about how important compassion actually is. So the HCAP survey says something like, how often did doctors or nurses explain things in a way that you understood? The Schwartz scale says, did they convey information in a way that was understandable to you? When we ask, how often did doctors listen carefully to you? The Schwartz scale says, I feel like I'm on a game show. The Schwartz scale says, did they listen attentively to you? Did they gain your trust? Did they involve you, right? Did they express sensitivity, caring, compassion? And you can see with these other questions, it's the same. So when we're talking about patient satisfaction, we have to make the connection for people that we're really looking at how compassionately did we respond, right? So let's talk about what the science says. I mean, there's not a ton of studies on compassion, but there's some. Shane Sinclair in Calgary in Canada has led a number of studies. He did this scoping review of the literature that included 44 studies on compassion. And 6 themes emerged in understanding what defines compassion for another. The first theme had to do with a nature of compassion. So the theme said that the results showed compassion was an outcome and a process of intuition and communication. It was grounded in emotional resonance and a response to suffering predicated on a number of virtues. They said there was this development of compassion, that there are inherent qualities of respect and dignity and care and kindness that seem to be embodied in a clinician's presence when compassion is present or observed. There are interpersonal factors, right? So compassionate relationship is marked by meaning and a genuine sense of care for the patient, right? That authenticity in the moment that we talked about. There's action and practical compassion. So basically, actions are what define compassion in the world. It's the little things. Patients in these studies said it was giving others the gift of quiet time and space, going above and beyond, following through on promises. It was the little things. There are barriers and enablers, which we've talked about. I think we're very aware of the barriers and enablers to compassion. And then there's outcomes, real outcomes in the literature. It aided recovery, included an increased sense of responsibility and control over the patient's health, their self-efficacy. Both patients and physicians agreed that compassionate care bolstered patient trust in both the system and the clinicians. It increased patient hope, and it was also associated with positive clinician outcomes, like increased job satisfaction and sustainment. And so this study was a grounded theory study with 53 advanced cancer patients, and they wanted to gain palliative care cancer patients' understanding and experiences of compassion. And they asked questions like, in terms of your own illness experience, what does compassion mean to you? Can you give me an example of when you experienced care that was compassionate? How do you know? I love this question. How do you know when a healthcare professional is being compassionate? And they found in these responses that there are certain virtues that come through: genuineness, love, honesty. I'm always curious to ask this question. How many of you are comfortable using the word love in your clinical practice? Hands? So I want to say that was like 40% of the room, right? So you'll go to see that the findings in their study actually say that love is the primary motivator of compassion. And the use of the word love in clinical practice, people have some thoughts and opinions about that. So patients understand that compassion takes place in this relational space. It happens in relationship. Compassion can't exist outside of relationship. Relationship to self, relationship to other, relationship to society, right? So there's the context of compassion, and then there's the content, what actually happens. So the patient awareness, how engaged we are, really knowing the person, prioritizing them, but also really focusing on the doing, the beneficent acts. Patients felt that there was a seeking to understand in compassion. They felt like somebody actually wanted to know who they were as a human being, right? Beyond the physical, beyond the bedpan, things like that. That there was relational communicating, again, verbal and nonverbal, again, really reflecting Dempsey's comments. That it was about attending to needs. So Did we really address multifactorial suffering in the care that we provide? Did we have active, there's that word again, active attendance to the whole person? And did we alleviate suffering in a really tangible way? And then again, these outcomes. Real outcomes like protecting patient well-being, because when we're actually communicating from a place of compassion, we're actually in a position to do that, to empower well-being and help it to grow. And they came up with this definition of compassion, a virtuous response that seeks to address the suffering and the needs of a person through relational understanding and action. And I'm just going to step down for a second. They created this model out of the grounded theory findings. And if you look on the left, the green is the healthcare provider, and you'll see the virtues of the healthcare provider that they talked about. And over on the right is the patient, the blue, and the suffering of the patient. And when the virtues of the healthcare provider meet the suffering of the patient, there is a virtuous response when compassion is present. And in that virtuous response, in this relational space, there is a seeking to understand, there is attending to needs, and there is relational communicating. And that leads to patient-reported outcomes, which informs the experience of the patient, the suffering of the patient, and the next time they confront or engage with the virtues of the healthcare provider. And they also differentiated between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. So they talk about sympathy as kind of this pity-based response, right? Very self-centered. You see the arrows just going down to the self. It's kind of all about us, right? It's really not that helpful. If we start to be able to free up our space of sympathy, we move into a space of empathy, which we're going to talk about. We're going to dive into empathy as a practice. There's two types of empathy, cognitive and affective. Cognitive and affective. The cognitive part is just, again, the acknowledgement of the suffering, an objective understanding of the distress, a duty-based response. If we can actually breathe long enough to drop into our heart, we start to tap into the emotional resonance that patients most resound with, right? There's the emotional resonance, effective understanding of the person's experience, and a person-centered response. And that takes us into a place where compassion becomes possible, right? And so when we're talking about all of these words and all these definitions and all these studies, it can be a little dry. And there are a lot of words that we use to describe compassion. Think of the person you think is the most compassionate provider, could be a parent, could be just somebody in the community you really respect. Who is compassionate in your mind? Think of that person, get an image of them. You may think of somebody who's kind, right? Somebody who's empathetic. You may kind of align forgiveness with the ability to be compassionate. Somebody who's generous, who knows how to be present, right? Somebody who can appreciate beauty and appreciate the mystery inherent to life. Somebody who embodies tenderness, right? There are all these words. In nursing, we talk a lot about caring, right? We mentioned sympathy. Really, there are like an endless number of words that come to mind when we're talking about compassion. And this is my favorite slide because it took me a really long time. But also because when I look at it, that to me is a really tall order. If you're telling me I have to be this every day at work for 12 hours, that's a good reason to call in sick. Yeah? I mean, I just can't. I'm human, right? So for the purpose of today and taking us through some embodiment practices over the next hour, what I want to do is I want to focus on these 8 words. These are the 8 component parts that we're going to work with in our bodies. So journalist Krista Tippett really says that compassion's become misunderstood in our modern day society as like a pity thing, right? Something for the sappy and the soft. And she challenges us to re-embody compassion through a lived ethic. She says what differentiates compassion in the world from all the other virtues is that you can see it. You actually know when you see compassion. And we know it through the presence of these component parts and the space that these component parts make possible. So we're going to start with kindness and empathy. So I start with kindness because I kind of see kindness as kind of like the basic premise of all the other component parts, right? Loving kindness is an ethical foundation of my profession. It's definitely in the teachings of the Buddha and that philosophy. And loving kindness along with compassion were actually 2 of the 4 immeasurables that the Buddha talked about. So I believe it's with a soft heart and soft eyes that we actually start to be able to cultivate empathy and move on that scale toward compassion, right? So there's a great, I guess it's a poem by Mother Teresa that my father always, he still sends it to me at least like once every few months. And in it she says, if you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. So be kind anyway. And Mother Teresa was a missionary of charity, and on a global scale, she really did embody these concepts of loving kindness and of compassion. And so Nightingale herself said the very first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm. But the level of transformative kindness that I'm talking about goes beyond do no harm. It's the intentional proliferation of goodness, right? It's mindful kindness. And kindness is no big thing, really. I mean, it starts right here with you and with me, and whatever judgments you have of me, and whatever judgments I have of you, and our willingness to just suspend those judgments and be available to each other. That's kindness. And there are lots of different ways of mobilizing kindness in the world, and one of my favorites is called moral imagination. And you'll find a lot of different versions of moral imagination. My favorite is the one by Acumen Fund. Jacqueline Novogratz started this organization years ago to really eradicate poverty on a global scale. And they do so by empowering people as entrepreneurs, particularly in low-income countries, with the skills they need to gain esteem, become leaders, and really contribute to society in a meaningful way. Jacqueline Novogratz tells this beautiful story of the blue sweater. Anybody know the book, The Blue Sweater? New York Times bestseller. Really good book. So I'll tell you the story of the blue sweater so you know the kind of world that Acumen is seeking to create. So she tells the story of this blue sweater that her Uncle Fred, really good book, Blue Sweater, her Uncle Fred gave her when she was a little girl. And on the front of it, it said Kilimanjaro, and it had mountains and giraffes and zebras. She wore the sweater every day. It was her favorite thing in the world. She wore it well into her adolescence when her womanly curves started to come into being. The sweater became a little tight and unfashionable in certain places. Went to school one day, and her arch nemesis kind of called her out and embarrassed her in a crowd for wearing this sweater. Said, well, we don't have to go to Africa. We could just ski down the slopes of Novogratz. Very embarrassed, very humiliated, she goes home. She has the ceremonial disposal of the sweater into the Salvation Army, and that was that. Years later, fast forward 10 years, she's now living and working in Rwanda in East Africa, thousands of miles away. She's going for her daily jog, and she sees a little boy wearing a blue sweater. And she runs up to the boy, and she doesn't speak Kinyarwanda, and he doesn't speak English. And the sweater says Kilimanjaro on the front. And she reaches forward, and she reaches for the back of the sweater, and right there in the collar is her name. And she uses this story as an analogy for how incredibly interconnected and interdependent we are, and how every day we make choices to do or not do, to say or not say, the things that affect people all around the world. And just a cool side note, one day I was sitting in this hotel in Rwanda, and I looked up, and there was Jacqueline Novogratz, and I ran up to her like a big geek, and sometimes I doubted the integrity of the story. I was like, she does not run up and down these hills. There's more hills in Rwanda than anywhere else in the world. And the next morning, I saw her on her jog, and I was like, gosh darn it, the story was true. So right there, so moral imagination, we're talking about mobilizing kindness. So right in the Acumen Manifesto, I'm going to show you an excerpt from the manifesto. What I love about it is that if you just clear your mind for a second and don't think about Acumen, this is the kind of kindness we so desperately need in our palliative care and hospice situations. I swear they could be talking about the work that we do. So good palliative care thrives on moral imagination. It is the humility to see the world as it is and the audacity to imagine the world as it could be. It's having the ambition to learn at the edge, the wisdom to admit failure, and the courage to start again. It requires patience and kindness, resilience and grit, a hard-edged hope. So this idea of kindness is about kindness as humility and audacity, right? Kindness as resilience and grit. Right? So this is the root of what I think a compassionate healthcare system really looks like. Nothing gentle about it. So one of my favorite ways to work with kindness is to practice it. So we're going to dive into a loving kindness meditation. And I'm going to take you through this loving kindness meditation. And it's going to start with a focus on the self and move into a focus on other and the world. And if feelings of love or kindness or difficulty come up, allow them to. Just allow whatever comes up for you to be there. If you nod off in the chair and you fall asleep, that's great too. You probably need the rest. Okay? So I will ask if you don't want to participate. That's absolutely fantastic. Please try to sit quietly and just respect the space for other people who are participating. And so as we work with kindness, we move into the space where empathy becomes possible. And as we talked about, there are really two modes of empathy, right? This cognitive space and this affective space. We're briefly going to talk about the cognitive, and then we're going to do a practice that just allows you to receive and drop into the affective. So basic principles of empathic communication, right? How we lead with our head, because it's important. Because a lot of us start with our head. I shouldn't speak for everyone. I start with my head. So the first thing is to start with the patient's agenda. This is really, really hard sometimes, particularly in a health system where we have our own agenda, where we have time constraints, where we have time restrictions. Compassion cannot exist in an environment with time constraints and time restrictions. It's like a pressure cooker, right? And that's why sometimes compassion is just too hard. And we can start with things like empathy, right? And just plant those seeds. So start with the patient's agenda. I was telling a group of people I was having dinner with last night that sometimes I struggle with this because I'm also a nurse coach, right? So from a coaching perspective, I want to guide the patient into their own wisdom. I want to create a reflective, safe space where you can just source your own answers because I know you have them. And I just want to ask reflective questions. And I want to hold silence. And I want to hold space. But I also see 6 consults and 2 new consults every day. And so sometimes I'm going to have to throw in some wisdom, you know? And so while I would like to practice clearing the path for the patient, sometimes it's a gentle ushering along, right? But I try to start with the patient's agenda always. That's an easy place to start because it's an acknowledgement, right? It's an acknowledgement that what you think and what's important to you matters. And then I can tell you what my agenda is, and then we can compromise on the agenda, and then we can get started on the conversation, and that can happen like that, right? The next part is to track both emotional and cognitive data. Tracking both the emotional and cognitive data. So what happens in the clinical setting is we're really good at tracking the cognitive stuff, right? Where do you live? Who do you live with? How many stairs do you have in your apartment? Is there room for a hospital bed on the first floor? Is religion important to you? Do you have a history of substance abuse? We can track all of that cognitive stuff. But tracking the emotional data is actually going to give us the information we need to make headway in this relationship, to foster trust, to foster compassion, to foster empathy. Stay with the patient and move the conversation forward one step at a time. And by one step at a time, we mean the patient's steps, right? So don't linger on and harp on things that you haven't accomplished. You can get back to them another time, right? Oh, we didn't achieve that. I really wanted to talk about that thing, and now she's talking about this. It's okay. You can get back to it, right? Keep up with them. Don't move ahead of them. If they're still trying to understand what hospice is, don't be talking about moving the bed into the house, right? Move at their pace. This is my favorite. I put it in bold just for that reason. Articulate empathy explicitly. This creates safety. Sometimes people feel uncomfortable doing this in my experience, in my teams, and it can be as simple as this. I empathize with what you're saying. Saying it explicitly to say, I hear you, and I actually hear what it means to you. I can track that emotional process that you're going through. It means something to me. Talk about what you can do before what you can't do. That's a really easy one, and it can save us a lot of grief in the clinical encounter. Let's focus on what's possible here, right? Rather than what's not possible. Start with big pictures. Pick big picture goals before getting to specific interventions, right? Like what do you value most and what's most important to you and what's your understanding about what's going on, right? Before we get to the nitty-gritty of, we're hoping to discharge you in the next 24 hours. That's a downer way to start a conversation. And then spend at least a moment giving the patient your complete, undivided attention. At least a moment, right? Just breathing, just holding space. So we're going to have a lot of moments today where we just hold silence. And my question to you is, how do you do with the silence? Does it make you uncomfortable? Does it make you excited? Is it an opportunity to process? I personally love silence. So I could just stand and be with you. I think it's great, right? It allows the energy in the room to settle, for human beings to connect, and for us to get clear about what the vibration is here. So that's the cognitive stuff. The affective stuff often involves us being in a state of receptivity. So this practice that we're going to do with empathy to awaken empathy in our body is just about being receptive. Literally, all you have to do is sit in your chair. I invite you to hold your hands in a receptive, open state. And your biggest task is to breathe and watch. I'm going to show you a video with the permission of the Cleveland Clinic. Most of you have probably seen it. What I doubt most of you have done is sit in a safe space, focus on deep breathing, sit in a receptive state, and allow yourself to be affected by what you're watching. So because this is a safe space, I invite you to allow yourself to be affected by what you're watching and respond emotionally however you choose to, okay? Breathe and receive. That's all you have to do. So we've moved through a lot of energy today, right? And cultivating these feelings and sensations of kindness and empathy. Oh, you guys who are leaving, we're getting into the good stuff. Oh my goodness. We're gonna do a hard one now. Is everyone excited? We're gonna jump into forgiveness. I know. And I love this part because there are people who are like, yeah, forgiveness. And there are people who are like, I don't care what he says. I'm not forgiven, whoever it is. Because I was right and they were wrong, and that's all there is to it. Let's leave it in the past. Totally cool. So let me just release the expectation that as we move through this embodiment practice and this story and this experience, I'm not asking you to forgive anyone. I'm asking you to create the possibility of attuning to what forgiveness brings to yourself and a relationship, just to consider it. And the reason it's important is because forgiveness is frequently a rite of passage at the end of life. We see families struggle to make peace in relationships that are very complicated, in histories that we will never understand. And if we want to bear witness and have the possibility of creating a compassionate environment with them, we need to have an appreciation for how challenging and difficult forgiveness can be, and also how healing it can be. And so personally, forgiveness has been one of my biggest spiritual practices. So that's my disclosure. I have done a lot of forgiving. A lot, gone back, called people, done the work. Yeah, I continue to have to forgive. And my biggest culprit is myself, right? Self-forgiveness is one of because I could not be more type A if I tried. So forgiveness is a big practice for ourselves. So I'm going to share a story of forgiveness, and then we're going to move into a practice of forgiveness. And again, the task of the practice is not that you forgive, it's that you create the possibility of recognizing what forgiveness can create. So in 2015, I moved to Rwanda in East Africa for 1 year. I worked with the Human Resources for Health program, which was a capacity building initiative that sought to increase the autonomy of Rwandan healthcare providers, improve the quality of their education, and really decrease dependence on foreign aid over a 7-year period. I really believed in the values of the program. It was all about needing us less and really boosting the morale and the education and competencies of local Rwandan healthcare workers. It was the best year of my life. It changed everything about how I see the world and myself and my place in it. And I just want to make sure we all know where we are in the world. Here's a world map. I am not a geography expert, but that is us over there on the left. And The yellow and green RW is the continent of Africa, and right there is where Rwanda is. And when you look at Rwanda, it's really kind of like a drop in the bucket on the continent. And it is bordered by Uganda to the north and Burundi to the south, Congo to the west, and Tanzania to the east. And that red square, Kigali, is the country's capital, and that's where I lived and worked. And it is called the Land of 1,000 Hills. I took this by a roadside with my iPhone. It is really that beautiful. The culture is contagious. The people are warm and friendly and incredibly generous, and really nobody is safe with their warmth and generosity, not even my mother when she visited. But the history of Rwanda is very violent and very complex and very difficult to understand. And actually, at the end of the year, I had to finally surrender to the fact that I will never really know what happened there. So I'm just pausing because 1 week ago started the annual commemoration of the genocide. It was 25 years ago that the genocide started. So on April 7th, 1994, the Hutu extremist government unleashed the genocide against the Tutsi. In just 100 days, it's estimated that roughly 1 million people were killed. That's about 10,000 people per day, about 715 people per hour, about 7 people killed every minute. Friends of ours who survived the genocide said, it was as if God forgot about Rwanda, as if it was the end of the world, as if the country had just fallen into darkness. And 25 years later, it's pretty spectacular. I mean, the country is really healing. Could we please make sure our phones are silenced? Thanks so much. There's incredible investment in the country. Communities are moving forward. There's still tension, there's still problems. But for the most part, it is a spectacular place to be. And back in the early 2000s, an NGO called, oh my goodness, just went out of my head, Prison Fellowship Rwanda, started these peace and reconciliation villages. And they started bringing together Tutsi survivors, who had lost their families, and Hutu perpetrators who had either been expelled from the country or served their prison sentence, who had no place to go. And they brought them together under one condition: forgiveness. You can have a place to live, you can have a plot of land to farm, you can start your businesses here, you can raise your families here, you can start over here, but only under the condition of forgiveness. And so while we were there, we went to one of these pieces. There's about 7 of these villages around the country, and we went to one of them several times, and we got to know the people very well. And this is Chantal. And Chantal is 36, which is how old I am. And I really resonate with Chantal because when I was 11 and doing spelling homework in my apartment with my mom, she was in her family's farm, being the youngest of 7 children, watching her father work, when men from the village came with machetes to kill him. Her oldest brother hid her in a loft space in the house, and she listened to the murder of her 6 siblings and her pregnant mother. And when some time had passed, she creeped down from the loft space to see if it was safe. She was afraid she would be left. And one of the perpetrators was still there and picked her up and threw her into a wall where she went unconscious. She was found who knows how long later on top of a mass grave, told she was barely breathing, was taken to a refugee camp, where after several months of living in the refugee camp, found that she had one surviving relative and was reconnected with her and was raised there. And now Chantal has 2 children. She has a small bar. She has a cow. She sells milk. And Chantal, over these period of years, has gone back to the prisons to forgive the men who killed her family. She sat across from them because she knew who they were. They were her neighbors. They were friends. It was a time of insanity, something, like I said, we will never understand, right? And I asked her one day, how could you forgive something so horrible? And she said, because a day came when I realized that not forgiving meant there was a black hole in my heart. And I saw a different future for my children. And I didn't want my children growing up with the kind of hatred that was inside me. And a time came when I had to let that go, because it was the only way to move forward. And her neighbor is this woman, who's a Hutu woman, whose husband is still in prison all these years later for the rape and murder of a young Tutsi girl. And on Sundays, when she goes to visit her husband in the prison, Chantal brings her lunch for her and her husband. She watches Chantal's children. They raise their kids together. They sing together. They go to church together. They dance together. Not everything is perfect, but they're showing up in life through this position in forgiveness. And I have to tell you that when you're standing there and you're listening to these stories, it is the most unbelievable experience of what humanity is capable of. And before I just keep going, if you'll just join me in a moment of silence for my friends and this country that I love very much as they're in this mourning period of remembrance, I would really appreciate that. Just sending them all that light you cultivated at the beginning of this time together. So in Chantal's story, I am reminded that it is possible to forgive anything. It is actually possible to forgive the unforgivable. She has been one of my greatest teachers. And because I heard what she said, that in not forgiving, the only healing and wholeness I prevent is my own. Oprah says that forgiveness is surrendering the hope that the other person can ever hurt you again. Another one of my favorite teachers, Ian Van Zandt, says that if you are really paying attention and if you are really ready to heal, the day will come when you realize that forgiveness is the only way back to the center of your innocence. And so I want to do a grounding practice with you. It's an embodiment practice, and it's called, it involves both empathy and forgiveness, and it's actually Pema Chodron's practice of stepping into another's shoes. Have people heard of this practice? We're gonna go through this together. So it's about honoring the inner subjective life and the worldview of another. It helps us to develop compassion for ourselves and this other person, and really can inspire this deep release of feelings and stagnant energy in the body. So the focus is on how the other person feels and how they view us, and it can be really helpful when words fail us, right? And my friend Taryn uses this in a lot of her trainings with conscious dying, and it's all a part of how we bear witness, how we actually hold empathy and forgiveness in the space for forgiveness. And once we get the hang of it, you can actually practice it on the spot with anyone. It's quite fascinating. So Pema Chodron says when we acknowledge our shared humanity with another person, we connect with them in a surprisingly intimate way. They become like family to us, and this helps dissolve our isolation and our aloneness. So there should be pieces of paper in the center of the table. Just grab one of those pads and a pen and just place it in front of you. We're not going to use it right away. So we're going to move into these last component parts, right? So we've talked about kindness, empathy, forgiveness. We're moving into generosity and presence. These practices are going to be a little briefer and a little quicker. And then the second part of the afternoon is really going to just be a dialogue, really asking some questions, hearing from you, and really just having some open discourse in the group. So generosity and presence. So generosity really asks us to put our money where our mouth is, right? So if we're unwilling to be generous, not just with our time and energy, but really with ourself, generous with our spirit, then, compassion is just a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. So the practice of generosity really only becomes possible through a steady and committed practice of presence. So Karen Armstrong is the author of the International Charter of Compassion, and she says that what we need is a new kind of discourse that goes back to the core values of all religions. Every single religion is based on compassion and on the golden rule. Do not do unto others as you would not like them to do unto you. She says, look into your own heart, discover what it is that gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstances to inflict that pain on anybody else. She goes on to say that does not mean we have to be filled with some soggy affection for the likes of Osama bin Laden, but we have to have concern and prevent the kind of situation, spiritual, social, political, economic, that creates a bin Laden and future bin Ladens possible. And she says, this is civilization. The golden rule is the basis of civilization. So Karen Armstrong really implies that as a mechanism for compassion, that this mechanism for compassion actually teaches us how it moves beyond just palliative care, but really into the field of social justice, that we have to have concern for society through our generosity and our lens for compassion. And so when we think on the golden rule, it's really this idea of being generous of spirit kind of personified, right? It's about making the choice to be the person that we actually expect others to be and refusing to repeat the acts of pain that have been inflicted on us. So people can challenge us and harm us, but the golden rule says, hey, let's look beneath the surface here. Muster our love, muster our acceptance, not necessarily our surrender, and then work from that space, right? It returns us to humanity. So, but there's one note about the golden rule that's always given me pause, right? Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. It kind of assumes that we all want to be treated the same way. And that's not really true, right? So the platinum rule says, treat others in a way that they want to be treated. So like, wow, I have to stop. I have to pause and listen. I have to willing to adapt and be flexible, right? I have to bear witness to what is being asked of me. And so Dr. Tony Alessandra says that the platinum rule shifts the focus of relationship from this is what I want and so I'll give it to you, to let me first understand what you want and let me work on that. And so the focus goes from this me-centered stance in the world to an other-centered stance of compassion, right? So it recalibrates what it actually means to be generous. We actually become not only generous with our spirit, but with our whole context and how we understand the world. We have to ask questions. We have to be curious. We have to inquire, right? And so this awareness really moves us and asks of us to be present. So to be authentically present means to be available to the allness of another human being, the allness of them, all of who they've been, who they are, and who they are becoming in this moment. Right? So we are changing every moment in energetic and cellular and experiential ways. And the care we provide, if it is to be truly human-centered, must remain present to the human condition as it is evolving, moment to moment, as a dynamic experience. Right? So Taryn Estes and I write about a concept called evolving human-centered care. And the definition is a little long-winded, so give me a break here for a moment. But I'm going to read it once or twice, right? And just think about what the definition is asking that we reframe evolving human-centered care as. So evolving human-centered care is compassionate and empathic care that responds, attends, and conforms to the human being as a living, breathing, evolving experience. Human as a fluctuating, phenomenological being of engagement. Human as history, as story, and as narrative. Human as presence, emergence, and possibility. Human as fellow sojourner. Human as caring healing. Human as love. So I'm just going to read it once because that was a lot. So presence really asks that we remain available to the human being and who they are becoming in each moment, right? This person that we see, if I see you tomorrow, you may appear physically similar to how I saw you today, but in deep ways that I may not know or understand, you are a completely different human. And the willingness to rise to that occasion is the courage we need to be present, right? That's where we find that solution. So because of the time, I'm going to skip the practice for now. I'm going to move through these last two component parts. If we get to it later, that's fine. But I want to focus on beauty for a second. So the whole idea of beauty as a precursor to compassion returns us to an aesthetic way of knowing, right? When we talk about hospice and palliative care, and we talk about holistic care, we're talking about all ways of knowing, right? Far beyond the empirics, right? Empirics are important. We involve the socio-political ways of knowing, the personal ways of knowing, but really returning to an aesthetic way of knowing, being able to see beauty in every moment, being able to see beauty amid great pain and suffering, right? Dr. Barbara Dossi says, the aesthetic way of knowing is the art of what we do that focuses on how to explore experiences and meaning in life with self or another. It is the integration and the expression of all the other patterns of knowing. So this moves us beyond even ethics and morals, really to just being aware of the uniqueness in any given moment. So the Buddha once taught an entire sermon, what's known as the flower sermon, in complete silence. He just plucked a flower, held it, and observed it with respect. And after a while, a smile was said to have graced his lips, and all understanding about life and love was held in that pause. So the practice of beauty and just dropping into this aesthetic way of knowing connects us to just the fragility of life. So the simple practice is just sitting where you are, opening your eyes, focusing your energy on your sight, on your observation, and just looking around the room and observing one thing. It can be a person, it can be a picture, it can be the light, it can be the comfort in your own body, whatever it is. And just observe something that's really beautiful in this moment right now. And just hang on to it. And allow yourself to be affected by it. And allow yourself to feel beautiful in this moment. Trust me when I say you're all beautiful. So, we're moving into the last parts, mystery and tenderness. So, Albert Einstein said, one cannot help but be in awe when he contemplates the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if one merely tries to comprehend a little of this mystery every day. And I say that living into this mystery is what actually avails us to the tenderness that's possible between people. Because there's this inherent mystery in life, right? This mystery in each of us, but also this mystery waiting to be found and seen and unlocked in relationship. I mean, when we think of how many relationships could exist in this room, how many mysteries are waiting to be identified, it's pretty magical, right? And it's in the mystery, it's in welcoming the not knowing where possibility is created, right? The knowing, how much we're expected to know all the time, can be very stagnant, right? The mystery of not knowing what we're going to say next, of not knowing exactly how we're going to be of service. It's quite beautiful, taking a breath and forming a practice around that type of surrender. On Friday, I just told the story again last night at dinner. I was at work, and my first patient was a 49-year-old woman with metastatic gastric cancer with 4 children. And the day before, she was just told that there was no more disease-directed treatment available. She was blood transfusion dependent, and even if she got those transfusions every day, likely in the next few weeks they would become refractory and she would die. And when I saw her on Friday morning, she was in shock. She literally was saying to me, I'm not dying, I'm 49. This is not possible. This isn't happening. I have a long life ahead of me. God will heal me, and that's my faith. Meanwhile, her son, who was in his 20s, was very emotional about this, also grappling with the facts as they were presented. And while his mother was very emotional and open-hearted and crying and asking questions, he was shutting her down and shutting me down. And I literally had to surrender. I had to surrender to the mystery that was possible in this space because I had to admit that I actually didn't know what to do. And I had to pause and lean back and take a breath and just ask for help. And just say, please help me know what to say. Please help me know what not to say. Please help me to hold this space. I don't know, it happened. Something kicked in. It went okay. Nobody was hurt, which was good news. But really, we actually got some resolution. We actually had some fascinating communication. But without that mystery, without leaning into the not knowing, that would have been a really uncomfortable situation. And tapping into the not knowing is actually a muscle that you can develop over time, right? If you've never asked about that or reflected on that, just consider as you go home what that looks like in your practice. So, the whole premise of this talk, the first half of this very long 2-hour talk, is that it's the basic actions that lay the groundwork for compassion to be practiced. I know I didn't go into tenderness. I'm actually going to talk about tenderness as the starting point for the afternoon, after break. And so one of the most powerful actions we can take is affirmation. And we can do that verbally. We can do that in our minds, but we can just participate in community and affirmation of creating a compassionate world. So back in 2008, Karen Armstrong won the TED Prize to create the Charter for Compassion. Thousands of people around the world have signed it. And it's just an affirmation to invite compassion into our societal awareness and our ways of being. So I join you to read it along with me. I know it's hard to read and affirm something you haven't read before, but if you feel so moved, please join me. If not, I'm just going to read it, and again, just receive it, and just be open to what it's saying. So it says, the principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions, calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves. Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures, to dethrone ourselves from the center of the world and put another there, and to honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being, treating everybody without exception with absolute justice, equity, and respect. It is also necessary in both public and private life to refrain consistently and empathetically from inciting pain, to act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest, to impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody, and to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies, is a denial of our common humanity. We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately, and that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion. We therefore call upon all men and women to restore compassion to the center of morality and religion, to return to the ancient principle that any interpretation of Scripture that breeds violence, hatred, or disdain is illegitimate, to ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information about other traditions, religions, and cultures, to encourage a positive appreciation of cultural and religious diversity, to cultivate an informed empathy with the suffering of all human beings, even those regarded as enemies. We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community. And so, in the end, like the statement I made at the beginning, compassion is really a complex virtue. And I think that these actionable parts, right? Kindness, empathy, forgiveness, generosity, presence, mystery, beauty, tenderness, these are what bring compassion to life in the world. It's how we know it. And so what I would say is never underestimate the power you have in role modeling these traits. You never know, really, the effect you have on people and the way you may change their lives. And, in the end, this is really not about creating a compassionate healthcare workforce or even a compassionate healthcare system. It's really about procuring compassion for humanity. and for the survival of humanity. It's really about, as we talked earlier, learning to tame the mad elephants with a beginner's mind. So I'm going to say thank you before our break, and I'm going to invite, we have 5 minutes. If anybody has questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. Oh, I thought you were going to say something, Dan.
No, I'm the runner.
Anything is fine, really.
Well, I can start us off. A lot of people say we don't have time. You brought that up a little bit, and what do? We have pressure of time to get the work done.
Yeah. So I think it's about focusing on the smaller parts, right? I may not have time to build this deeply compassionate relationship today. That's how I see it. But I may have time to extend a kindness, right? Whether it's to a colleague or to a patient or to a family, or to just be grounded in kindness, right? To use those component parts as an intention for the day. Maybe my intention for the day is just to be present to just how busy I am, to be present to just how much I feel like I am chasing my own tail all day, and then to be present to how much I'm not making myself available to others, right? And in those small little opportunities, we have an opportunity and an invitation to do something differently. And that's how we grow, right? Because we can blame the system, we can talk about the time constraints, we can talk about how much we have to do in our checklist and our agenda, or we can be present to the reality of that and then start to role model something differently. And like I said, my point with kindness in particular, it takes nothing. Like, people can actually pick up your kindness, right? People can pick up if you're judging them or if you're open to them, right? And so just the mere internal process of suspending that judgment and being open to who this human being is in the moment is like the boldest act of kindness, right? And if it's accompanied with something that's demonstrable in the world, well, that's even better, you know? So I wouldn't buy that nobody has time for kindness. I wouldn't buy that nobody has time for presence. And so that's somewhere to start. Any other thoughts? We have a few minutes. So I'll tell you, this afternoon is really going to depend on your interaction with me. So maybe we could just practice. Somebody say something. Or the afternoon's really going to drag. I mean, it's going to drag.
Hi, I'm Sheila. I'm a social worker for Hospice, Winona. Hi. What I wanted to mention was just the political climate and the lack of kindness. And I thought we were on such a wonderful pathway of treating each other kind, and a beautiful world in the last few years have brought out so many people who I didn't know thought the way they thought. That there's more meanness in the world than I thought there was. So I feel like I was deceived for a while, and it's hard now to be around people sometimes and feeling the evilness even that I really did. I guess I was naive to it. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I'll digress from politics, but I will say that, you know, the climate is very noticeable in our news and in what we see in the United States. And, you know, I don't have an answer for that. I will say that these practices have helped to ground me and release some of my own self-expectation and burden of feeling like I have to like everyone. I mean, like, think for a second, like, how many people you really like. Like, I really don't like that many people. I mean, like, when I say really like, I mean, like, do you want to invite them over and drink wine around a fire pit on a Friday? You know, like, that kind of like. Do you want to, like, bring them into your house and say, take off your shoes, stay a while? How many people do you really like, right? And sometimes I think that, sometimes I think that it's just being honest about that and releasing the expectation that things have to be different. I think sometimes that gives us the freedom to role model something different, right? Like, I don't have to like you to be kind to you. Those are two very different things. I don't have to like you to empathize with you. Those are very different things, right? I'll talk about a question that I ask later that I use when I'm triggered in the clinical environment with somebody I really don't like, but somebody I'm still in service to. And how do I do that? And I just ask this simple question that connects me ultimately to the fact that they're a human being first, and they are everything else I think about them and everything else I'm judging with them with second. So our shared humanity comes first. My judgments of you come second. I'm very clear on that. But that's something that I've had to develop over time, right? But it doesn't mean I can't set a boundary and say, you don't have my permission to disrespect me in the clinical environment. I'm here to be of service. I'm very clear on my boundaries. Compassion is still possible, I think.